The Vikings were seafarers from southern Scandinavia who spoke Old Norse. They maintained trade relations with Northern Europe. These interactions took place across a vast area of northern, central, eastern, and western Europe from the late 8th century to the 11th century CE. Norse were a branch of the Germanic peoples whose ancestors came from Denmark, crossing the seas of Skagerrak and Kattegat before settling in Sweden and Norway. The word Viking derives from Vik, which in Old Norse meant bay or inlet. This meaning appears in many place names such as Narvik, Schleswig, Reykjavik, Brevik, and Viklo. A Viking was someone who raided lands along bays and coastlines. By Viking civilization, we refer to the culture of the Scandinavian peoples during the Viking Age, which began around 700 CE and ended around 1100 CE. Between 800 and 1050 CE, for 3 centuries, Viking warriors with their longships spread fear across Europe. They set out from Scandinavia in search of silver, slaves, and land. Some traveled to Britain and France, while others advanced into Russia and the distant rivers of Asia. The Vikings were bold explorers and skilled seafarers who fearlessly crossed the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and the Americas 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. Around the year 1000 CE, Vikings sailed from the British Isles to Greenland, established a colony, and then traveled onward to Labrador, Baffin Island, and finally Newfoundland. There they founded a settlement called Vinland, Land of Wine, and from that base moved along the coasts of North America, observing local plants, animals, and indigenous peoples and interacting with them. Although the Vikings never returned to United States, other Europeans learned of their achievements and were fascinated by stories of the discovery of the New World by these formidable seafarers. However, the Vikings lacked sufficient resources to continue their explorations. Their trade networks nevertheless remained active for centuries, especially around the Mediterranean Sea. Viking explorers ventured into the turbulent waters of the North Atlantic Ocean in search of new lands. Most of them came from Norway, where narrow valleys were home to many people and arable farmland was scarce. Between 800 CE and 1001 CE, they discovered the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. Soon, fleets of ships carrying settlers and explorers followed them there. However, because sea travel at that time was far from safe, many ships were lost in storms and never reached their destinations. Norwegian Vikings discovered Iceland around the year 870. With favorable winds, sailors could reach it from Norway in a 7-day voyage. By 930 CE, about 10,000 Vikings were living in Iceland. Greenland was also identified by Norwegian Vikings after they lost their course in a storm. Eric the Red, a chieftain who had been forced to leave Iceland for murder, reached Greenland's coasts around 984–985 CE. To encourage settlement, he named it Greenland, Greenland. 2 small Viking communities survived there for nearly 400 years through farming and hunting deer and walrus, but after 1410 CE most of them disappeared. Leif Erikson, known as Leif the Lucky, was the son of Eric the Red. Around 986 CE, after losing his course in a storm, he sailed west of Greenland. When he landed in Newfoundland, he became the first European known to set foot on the mainland of the Americas. He named this land Vinland, Land of Wine, because of the abundant grapes and large wild berries he found there. Continuing along the coast, he discovered Markland, Forest Land, and Helluland, Land of Stones, which are believed to correspond to Labrador and Baffin Island. In later years, other Vikings and settlers traveled to Vinland, but they did not remain there for long. Three main reasons are identified for Viking incursions into other lands. First, population growth led to overcrowding in their homeland, and a shortage of limited resources such as farmland for agriculture and livestock. Second, the spoils gained from raiding foreign territories financed the rulers' expenses, and enabled them to maintain their traditional way of life by distributing gifts to their followers, thereby enhancing their prestige. Third, for those condemned to exile, it had become increasingly difficult to find uninhabited land or refuge within the homeland. These factors also encouraged improvements in ship design, allowing them to reach more distant lands. Nevertheless, Viking kings did not always view these overseas expeditions favorably, as such territories could become havens for lawbreakers and sources of their growing power. It is therefore said that Sweyn, after coming to power in Norway, prohibited attacks on foreign lands. The Vikings began their raids on western lands around 800 CE, casting a shadow of fear across Europe. These attacks spread as far as the shores of the Atlantic Ocean and the coasts of Spain. Poor European farmers were unable to resist them, as small kingdoms had emerged throughout the continent, and the Frankish Empire was fragmenting and entangled in internal conflicts. Under such conditions, Europe, shaped by its feudal system, was unprepared to defend itself against the raiders. Although medieval Vikings bore little behavioral resemblance to the Vikings of the 9th century, many films and stories still portray them as savage. Archaeological research clearly shows this image is inaccurate. For many Vikings, livelihood did not depend solely on raiding and plunder, but on occupations such as farming and fishing. Artifacts discovered by archaeologists reveal that in everyday life they used tools like sickles, fishing spears, shovels, pickaxes, and plows, all agricultural implements. When these tools are considered alongside other historical evidence, it becomes clear that the Vikings were advanced farmers and fishers, using timber from the forests of Scandinavia. They built their large and renowned ships, which enabled them to trade with neighboring lands, other parts of Europe, and regions of Asia. Vikings possessed notable skill in working iron, using it to produce both tools and weapons. Through trade, they also acquired gold and precious European gems to craft jewelry. Most homes were constructed from wood and stone. Their ability to build durable fortifications from these materials contributed to their advantage over many other European peoples. The Vikings were travelers and explorers. Their ships, often resembling large, narrow boats, were capable of withstanding severe maritime weather such as heavy rain and storms. They sailed and fished from the coasts of Sweden to the rivers of Eastern Europe that flow into the Black Sea, and even reached regions as far as the Middle East. The presence of the names Allah and Ali on silk garments and rings found among Vikings in Burka and Gamla Uppsala provides strong evidence of Viking contact with peoples of Iran and China. These names, written in Kufic script, often appear together. Some of these graves may have belonged to Muslims, but it is more likely that the discoveries indicate Viking exposure to Islamic ideas, including beliefs about eternal life, leading them to dress their dead in such garments. Connections between Germanic peoples and the Iranian world, especially among the northern Germanic groups. The Vikings remained significant in the period after the rise of Islamic Iran. The renowned Viking sword, Ulfbert, is closely linked to Iran. Research by scholars at Stockholm University on trade along the Volga River notes that Vikings sailed from Lake Mälaren in Sweden to northern Iranian ports between 800 and the mid-1000s CE. It is widely believed that the steel used in Ulfbert's swords came from Iran and was obtained through friendly trade relations, in exchange for furs and other northern goods transported by river vessels. When the Sasanian Empire was collapsing under Arab conquests in the 7th century CE, resistance in northern Iran continued. Supported by advanced metallurgical technology. This technology benefited Viking traders traveling via the Volga. Evidence suggests that Vikings had contact with Iran even earlier. During the Sasanian era, it appears that in the late Sasanian period Vikings adopted segmented helmets similar to that of Khosrow II, as depicted in the rock relief at Taki, Boston near Kermanshah. Scholars have also noted striking similarities between this royal Sasanian helmet and those depicted in Scandinavian burial sites at Vendel and Valsgard. Perhaps the most remarkable discoveries are those of Iranian silk found in Viking trading ships. Researchers at the University of Oslo report that the amount of silk imported into Norway from Iran appears to have been greater than that imported from Constantinople. Many silk textiles discovered in Viking contexts bear imperial Iranian motifs, and some fabrics woven using advanced Samite techniques display religious imagery associated with pre-Islamic Iran.